Hello, everyone. My name is Thijs Monté. I'm a solution engineer at BMC. And first of all, thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited about the topic we are covering today. Today, I'm going to present and demo BMC Helix Control-M, which is BMC's SaaS offering for our existing ControlM offering. And it's a response to the increasing demand from our customers for SaaS products in general, but that also includes ControlM. So I'm hoping you're as excited as I am. So let's get started. So as I already mentioned, BMC Helix Control-M is an offering for ControlM as a service. This means that BMC is taking care of the hosting and administration of the backend, so our customers can focus on the configuration and the workflow management. BMC Helix Control-M is based on the existing ControlM and shares the same code base. Although there are some differences, all the core capabilities of ControlM are also available in BMC Helix Control-M. Some limitations compared to on-prem are due to the fact that we need to re-architecture things like our archiving module, for example. So that's something that we plan to do in the future, as well as providing a migration path from on-prem to ControlM Helix. But this is part of our roadmap, and as always, this is subject to change. In order to deliver a high available and secure solution, we worked with AWS to make sure the architecture adopts all the best practices that are available. So AWS has this SaaS factory, which is helping vendors like BMC to come up with such an architecture, which is AWS well-architectured framework. And this is also applicable for ControlM. And talking about the architecture, let's dive a little bit into that before I go into the demo. The cooperation with AWS has led to an architecture based on all the best practices to build a true multi-tenancy SaaS offering with both high availability and security by design. The initial hosting is AWS West, Oregon. By leveraging AWS services like SQS for agent traffic, we can run workloads anywhere in the world, on any on-prem data center or on any public cloud provider. And this doesn't have to be AWS. The same goes for accessing our web portal from anywhere in the world. By leveraging services like WAF, which stands for Web Application Firewall, CloudFront, Secret Manager, and API Gateway, you can access ControlM Helix in a safe manner from anywhere in the world. And for our European customers, BMC is accredited for binding corporate rules. And this is a facility by the EU for multinationals like BMC to ensure GDPR compliancy, no matter where the data is hosted. And on top of that, it's good to know that the only potential personal identifier information is user email. For authentication, we support any external identity provider that supports SAML 2.0. The authorization model in Helix Control-M is similar to the existing ControlM offering, including role-based administration capabilities that was added in version 20. The backend components itself are fully isolated in the network layer. Here we defend the traffic in the namespace itself, making sure there is complete separation for each tenant in their own namespace. And we are using EKS, which is a managed Kubernetes service from AWS, and Calico to lock the kernel layer. We ensure pods running on Kubernetes can't see each other. And for data storage, we use Amazon RDS, where each tenant is separated by its own schema on the database layer. So there's no data flowing from one tenant to another. Now, the best thing about that architecture is that you don't have to worry about it. This is something we as BMC manage for you. And that brings me to the next topic, availability and support. All the backend components we saw on the previous slide are managed by BMC. Existing ControlM customers can think of components like the Enterprise Manager and the ControlM Server. And in order to achieve the best possible customer experience, we've added 3 teams to our organization. This allows us to deliver the same SLA as you are accustomed to for our existing ControlM customers. But this time it's including the management and hosting of all the infrastructure and the backend components. We provide 99.95% availability, which means a maximum of 4 hours unplanned downtime per year. And we are proud to share that since the launch, we haven't had any unplanned outage at all. For any required maintenance, we provide a 3 weeks notice. In case of upgrades, we allow our customers to request an upgrade on a non-production tenant in order to facilitate any testing and validation exercises. And for our agents, we have an 18-month period where we support, we have backend compatibility with previous agent versions to allow our customers time to upgrade their agents. Now, that brings me to the demonstration for today. And to demonstrate the capabilities of BMC Helix Control-M, we are taking a use case of a data pipeline. It holds elements of any type of process we can automate. There's data feeding the process, there is the processing itself, and there is the output of the process. And in order to structure my demo, I've divided that into the following topics. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the general introduction in the web interface of BMC ControlM Helix. Then we're going to define our first jobs, and then we're going to see how we can monitor these type of jobs. And once we've covered those basics, we can look at a more complex example. And in our case, we've prepared an example of an end-to-end data pipeline in the finance industry. And finally, we're going to see how we can expose that information to our business users. So for the data pipeline, as I said before, it holds elements of any type of process we automate. On the very left, we have the source applications feeding the data pipeline. On the far right, we have our business users and the use cases. That eventually somebody at the business is caring about the outcome of the process. And in the middle, we have the processing by the data engineers. Now, this is a data pipeline process. Similar aspects are applying to any type of other process, like a financial close process, for example, or a replenishment process in retail, or a predictive maintenance use case. Now, in order to facilitate these different stakeholders, we have different interfaces. Now, BMC Helix Control-M works with the web portal, of course, where our application teams and operations user can see the detailed monitoring. We also have a self-service view for our business users that can see an aggregated view of these workloads and see more kind of a traffic light style dashboarding. And finally, we have our DevOps user who might prefer to work in a jobs as code approach. So without further ado, I'm going to switch to the demo. So here I'm logged into BMC Helix Control-M. As I mentioned before, the web portal is our primary interface for our existing Control-M customers. There is no GUI available for Helix Control-M. It's purely web-based, API-based, or the self-service view, as I mentioned before. Now, in order to onboard new users, either because there are new customers or there are new use cases within our existing customers that might want to leverage Helix Control-M in conjunction to an existing Control-M installation. In a lot of cases, we see new personas working with Control-M, and therefore we paid a lot of attention in making the onboarding an easy process. And part of that is this user guide we are showing at initial login, where we guide our users through the process of setting up your first agents, creating a job flow, and learn how to monitor them. And just to demonstrate how this works, I'm going to show how the process of installing an agent and how the guide can help us with that. And as we can see, we get on-screen coaching of that user guide. And here we see there's a menu over here where we can navigate to our agents. And here we can choose to install an agent. And here we see the several different platforms we are supporting for our agent. And we can choose the agent of our choice. And then we can either go for a manual installation and grab the binaries by copying the wget or curl command from here and go to our CentOS box in this example in order to run that installer. And for that, we specifying an agent tag. Now, an agent tag is something we use to delegate the administration of the agents to the application teams. So think of the data pipeline I showed before. There were many teams involved in that. And in a modern approach of workload orchestration is that each team is enabled to own their own workloads. And with this setup, we can facilitate that. We can still, of course, facilitate a central ownership of these workloads. But in case of decentral DevOps-oriented teams, we can allow them to own their own workloads without having the capabilities of updating agents of a different team. Right? So these agent tokens basically controls which user can maintain which agent. Of course, we also allow an automated install. So think of infrastructure as code capabilities where we can integrate into tools like Ansible or Terraform, where application teams might want to automate the provisioning of their agents. So for that, we provide the instructions how to do that in the same view as well. And therefore, of course, our automation API, which if you're an existing ControlM customer, you might know that from the existing ControlM offering. It's also available for Helix Control-M. For this demonstration, I've already set up agents. We can see them here in the web. For our existing customers that are working with the configuration manager of ControlM in the existing ControlM offering, there's no such thing for Helix ControlM, but we provide that information through this web portal. And a lot of these things, by the way, are also available through the web interface of our latest ControlM version. So here we see one agent that is unavailable, but luckily we also have two agents that I'm going to use for today's demo that are available. Now, as I mentioned during the architecture, we use AWS SQS for agent traffic. So there's no communication initiated from our backend to your agent. It's the agent pulling towards AWS SQS. So there's only an outbound connection required, and there's no open connection required from the internet to your, let's say, on-prem agent, or if that agent is running on a cloud. There's no need for such an open connection. Now, let's start with defining our first workflow. And like our existing ControlM, we have different domains to facilitate different things. So the planning domain is where we define our jobs. And here we're going to create our first workspace. And for this environment, we're using a site standard. And some customers might be familiar with this. It's the same concept as we have in our existing ControlM offering, where with site standards, we can automate our rules we want to apply on our jobs. So for example, this can be naming convention. It can be certain rules around when we need to notify when jobs are failing. It can be rules around using certain resources when we connect to a database. So typically, from a management perspective, we have all kinds of requirements for our job definitions, and site standards is a way of automating that. And especially when we are going to delegate this to different teams, we can't always be next to that person that is creating these jobs. And therefore, we have these site standards that will do this for us. On this environment, we are starting our workflows with the first three letters of our login. And this is just to avoid that I'm interfering my demo with the demos of my peers. Now, what we see here is our first folder, and we automatically start with a folder. And for those that are not familiar with ControlM, a folder in ControlM is basically the same thing like we have when we are organizing our files on our file system. It's just a way to organize our jobs. We can have folders and we can have subfolders, and we can put jobs in these and connect these jobs in workflow and organize them in different folders. Because of our site standards, we already have a default name of our job, starting with my user code, so I don't have to worry about that. We see currently I'm not compliant to the site standard indicated by the red exclamation mark, because in our case, we've configured that we only want to allow lowercase just for consistency. And this is just an example. You can also, well, the site standards can be put optional, but to manage high volume of jobs, this is typically a lot of value add in the setup of ControlM. I'm going to give it a proper name, and we now see that our name is okay. So in order to orchestrate any type of workload on any different platform, we do see here all the common job types we know from ControlM. There are a few differences compared to our existing ControlM offering. And this is mainly less popular job types that that we might add in a later phase, depending on the priorities on our roadmap. But all the common job types like SAP, databases, file transfers are available in ControlM Helix. For now, I'm just keep it simple. We're going to look at a more complex workflow later on. I'm going to define my first job. So I'll give it a name, and I'm going to specify on which agent I want to run this. And in this case, I'm just going to run it on this specific agent. I'm going to specify a run as agent, a run as user. Sorry, in our case, that's CTM agent. So this will be the user which will be used to execute the command on that agent. Now let's run the hostname command just as an example. And I can add more jobs, of course. So for the existing ControlM customers we have in the session today, you might have noticed that this web view is pretty much similar to what we have in our version 20 of ControlM. And that's because we're sharing the same code base. There are a few differences. We applied a few changes in naming convention, but those changes will most likely also be applied to our ControlM version later on. Okay, so of course I can connect jobs, right? So also like in the GUI of our existing ControlM offering in the web, we can do the same thing. I can reorganize them a bit to not have such a messy workspace. And of course, we can also create parallel processing. And I will just put a sleep command. Okay, so by just dragging it like this, we have our first workflow with some parallel jobs. Just make this 10 seconds. So now we're ready to do a check-in, meaning we're activating this change. So of course we can attach all kind of scheduling rules, simple scenarios like every day, but of course also very complex scenarios like every third Tuesday of the month, unless it's a business holiday, things like that. I will not be covering those scenarios today, but it's basically the same thing as we have in our existing ControlM offering. So now I'm going to run this workflow. And I'm going to switch to the monitoring domain. And therefore, I'm going to create a new viewpoint. And a viewpoint is just basically a filter on the jobs you want to see. And as we see here, all jobs have been completed successful. We see they're all indicating by their status colored green. We see they're okay. We can go into the details. We can see the output. If necessary, we can see any errors here. We can rerun jobs if needed, and so we can interact with that. So this is what we do in the monitoring domain. Now, we've covered the basics of defining jobs, monitoring jobs. We've looked a bit on how we can set up agents. And here I've only been using OS job types. And of course, we can deploy plugins like we do on our existing ControlM offering on top of the base agent to give that agent the capability to talk to SAP or to do file transfers or to talk to AWS or Azure. And in the example I've prepared, we will see a couple of different job types. So what we see here is basically a replication of that slide showing the data pipeline. We have our source applications at the top. In the middle, we have the different stages of processing that data. And eventually at the bottom, we will see our use cases. For our use cases, for those who are wondering, we are using the SLA job type. It's renamed into SLA management now. Existing customers might know this as batch impact manager jobs, which was the terminology we used before. And this is what we use to aggregate the status of a certain workflow in order to represent that towards our business users. Now let's see how we can run such a more complex example. And before I do that, just to explain, we see all these different boxes, and each box basically represents a different team in my setup. Right, so we have the different source applications feeding into a data pipeline. We have the data enrichment and data ingestion, and typically there's a different team taking care of this part. On top of that, there typically is a data quality team if we're talking about data pipelines that will run a certain scorecards to see if the data is of good quality. And eventually we have the representation layer in order to make great visualizations with tools like Power BI or Tableau or any other visualization tool. I'm going to run it. And, the beauty of Helix Control-M is that we can have this end-to-end view, but at the same time we can allow these teams to own their own piece of the workflow. And especially this is what we see at systems of innovations, where teams are working with cloud technologies, working in a DevOps-based operating model, and they can own their part of the flow. But still, in the end of the day, you need to have that end-to-end visibility of your process. And it can be any type of business process, like I mentioned before. Those are typically replenishment processes or financial close processes. We want to stay on top of these things in order to know if we are going to meet our SLA at the business side. What we see here on the source applications, most of them are ready. We see one is waiting for my confirmation, which I'll do right now. And one of the use cases in this setup is customer satisfaction. Now, in order to mimic a typical source like CRM systems and maybe social media and marketing tools, I'm just going to pull a data feed from Twitter as one of the source applications. And we see that over here. And of course, Twitter is not a very common job type maybe for ControlM, but with the application integrator module, which is also available on Helix ControlM, we can create our own job types. Right? We can wrap any REST endpoint or command line utility in a job type and use that in our workflow and reuse it over and over again without the complexity of calling scripts each time. For today's session, we're going to look at it's a financial data pipeline. I've just chosen a Bitcoin to search on Twitter, see how people are tweeting on that. You never know how positive or negative people are, depending on well, probably the time of the day talking about Bitcoins. So if we go into the output of this job, we will see, let me open that to make it a little bit bigger. We see some raw data like people tweeting something with Bitcoin in it. We see the person who's tweeting that, the time. That's basically it, some basic metadata. Now, part of the workflow, I'm also analyzing this with AWS Comprehend, which is a cloud service, where we are sending that data and getting a sentiment analysis based on that data. Like, this is just one of the use cases built on this data pipeline. And typically in finance, we see things like finance and risk reporting, or we see use cases like crime detection. And as we see, this is progressing. And while this pipeline is running, we can have a look at the view of the business. Right here we see that all these workflows are running. They're scheduled to be on time. There are no alerts. We're not only looking at if jobs are ending okay, we also look if they take longer than expected or maybe go faster as expected, right? If we are processing only a limited amount of the data, probably there's something wrong and we want to be alerted on that. And that's what we keep track of with our SLA management capabilities. Now, if we click on any of those use cases, we will see a filtered version of that pipeline. In this case, we don't see all the other use cases, we just see these use cases. And we currently see that the data quality jobs are running. We're checking if the data quality is okay. We're making use of resources here. So we're basically limiting the amount of jobs we can run in parallel. This is just one of the typical ControlM capabilities we know, which is also available in Helix Control-M. While this is running, let me just show you the outcome of that data enrichment, where we see the job output. And this time it's not only the metadata, like the tweet itself and the time it was created. We also see a sentiment, right? This is the outcome of our algorithm we ran. And we see for each tweet if it was positive or negative or neutral. So we can aggregate and build some kind of customer satisfaction report at the end. So we're almost done. The tweets are aggregated, so now my report should be ready. I already prepared that up front. Yeah, I also get it in my email now. And as we see here, well, this is an example based on what people are tweeting about Bitcoins. So 77% is neutral. There's probably a lot of just messages on the stock itself. Mostly positive compared to the amount of negatives. This is just as an example, right? We use a very simple open source visualization tool here. Typically, our customers are running tools like Power BI, Tableau, Click software. So that concludes the overview demo of ControlM Helix. Before I wrap it up, I do want to mention also that the jobs as code approach is also available in ControlM Helix. We can have a quick look at an example of that. As we just saw in the web portal, we here have the same thing, but now in jobs as code. Each job type has its own specifics to it. We either fill it in here in jobs as code, or we go in the GUI and fill in these fields in the web GUI, of course. I mean, and what I think a key thing of this setup are the events. And events is an example of a terminology we are updating. So existing ControlM customers might know this as a condition. But basically, the data ingestion team can subscribe to events from the source applications, because we only want to run the data ingestion when the source application is actually ready. Right. So in a DevOps setup, each team can own their own part of the pipeline. Doesn't necessarily have to be in jobs as code, right? We can do the same thing in the web portal, and we can subscribe on these events. And when we're done, we're also publishing an event internal in ControlM. So other teams can, like the data quality team is subscribing on the data ingestion team. So this is how we can build end-to-end workflows in an agile way, still maintaining end-to-end control and visibility. So that concludes the demo of today. As we've seen, we've put a lot of emphasis on creating an easy onboarding in a modern web-based user experience. We've seen how easy it is to define our job flows with a drag and drop approach, or potentially with jobs as code. We've seen how we can monitor these jobs in our monitoring domain. And we've seen that example of the data pipeline, how we can have end-to-end control and visibility and being agile at the same time by allowing each team to own their own part of the workflow. And finally, we see how we can increase collaboration with our business users by providing them insights in our workflows in an aggregated way. So thank you for your time. In case you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And thank you for your time.